Welcome back to Real World Enterprise Architecture. This is a podcast for architects who are tired of being technically right and organizationally irrelevant. For those who sense, often uncomfortably, that frameworks alone don't buy influence, clarity, or leadership. And for those who are starting to realize that architecture, when practiced seriously, is not a neutral activity. Today, we're talking about leadership. Not leadership as a title, not leadership as a soft skill checklist, and definitely not leadership as something that magically appears once you become senior enough. We're talking about leadership as a competence, as something you practice under pressure, as something that shows up when decisions have consequences and when people don't agree. And here's the uncomfortable truth we need to start with: leadership is political, whether you like it or not. The moment you step into an enterprise architecture role, you step into a political system. There are interests, incentives, power structures, informal hierarchies, fears, ambitions, and unresolved conflicts. Pretending that your role is purely technical or worst, purely objective, doesn't make those forces disappear. It only guarantees that someone else will navigate them instead of you. Too many architects still cling to the idea that if they stay neutral, professional, and methodical, leadership will somehow emerge organically. That if they produce the right analysis, the right models, the right recommendations, the organization will do the right thing. But organizations don't move because something is correct. They move because someone pushes, challenges, negotiates, confronts, and sometimes absorbs the cost of friction. This episode is about that competence, the kind of leadership that doesn't hide behind process, the kind that doesn't confuse calmness with maturity or politeness with effectiveness, the kind that understands that power exists even when no one names it, and refusing to engage with it is not virtue, it's abdication. And let me be clear about something early on. This episode is not about office politics in the superficial sense. We'll go there in the next episode directly and unapologetically. This one is about what comes before that: your capacity to lead with intention, to stay present when disagreement shows up, to hold your ground without becoming reactive, to generate conflict deliberately when avoidance will be easier. Because if you cannot do that, no amount of architectural rigor will save you. You'll be respected, you'll be invited, you'll be thanked, and then you'll be ignored. Leadership for architects begins long before anyone gives you authority. It begins with your willingness to enter uncomfortable spaces without losing clarity. And that's what we're unpacking today. One of the most damaging misconceptions I see in enterprise architecture is this idea that mature professionals avoid conflict, that good architects smooth things over, that leadership means keeping everyone aligned, calm, and comfortable. This belief is widespread and completely wrong. Avoiding conflict is not maturity, it's often fear dressed up as professionalism. Many architects pride themselves on being reasonable. They phrase everything carefully. They soften recommendations. They delay decisions in the name of alignment. They avoid drawing hard boundaries because they don't want to be seen as difficult, political, or confrontational. And they genuinely believe this makes them better leaders. In reality, it makes them safer participants and weaker architects. Conflict is not a failure of architecture. Conflict is information. It tells you where priorities collide, where incentives diverge, where strategy is ambiguous, and where power is unevenly distributed. When conflict appears, something real is happening. And when architects rush to eliminate it, they are not resolving anything. They are erasing the very signals that should guide architectural judgment. Here's what avoidance often looks like in practice. An architect sees that two business units are driving incompatible initiatives, but instead of naming the contradiction, they design a flexible target state that accommodates both. Another architect knows a roadmap is unrealistic given operational capacity, but reframes the concern as future risk instead of challenging the timeline. A third notices that governance decisions are being driven by politics rather than value, but stays silent because it's not our role to get involved. All of this is conflict avoidance, and all of it produces architecture that looks elegant on paper and collapses under reality. The irony is that many architects justify this behavior by appealing to maturity. They tell themselves they are being pragmatic, diplomatic, strategic, but real maturity is not the absence of tension, it's the ability to remain grounded inside it. Emotional maturity shows up when you can tolerate disagreement without becoming defensive, when you can hold a clear position without needing everyone to like it, when you can generate constructive conflict without scaling into ego battles. And this is where many architects struggle, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack tolerance for discomfort. Conflict forces you to take a stance. It forces you to choose what matters. It exposes trade offs, and trade offs, by definition, produce losers as well as winners. Avoiding conflict allows you to postpone the reckoning, but only temporarily. Eventually, the organization will make those choices anyway, just without architectural coherence. There's another hard truth here. Architects who avoid conflict often believe they are protecting relationships. In reality, they are protecting their own position. They fear being labeled political. They fear damaging trust. They fear losing access. And so they retreat into neutral language, process talk, and facilitation mode. But leadership doesn't come from being agreeable, it comes from being clear. If you're never the source of productive tension, you are not leading. You may be supporting, you may be coordinating, you may be documenting, but you are not shaping outcomes. An architecture that does not shape outcomes becomes ornamental, present, impressive, and ultimately ignored. This is why competence beyond frameworks matters, because no framework teaches you how to sit in a room where senior stakeholders disagree and still move the conversation forward. No method tells you how to surface a contradiction without triggering defensiveness. No model prepares you for the moment when you must decide whether to speak up or stay comfortable. That capacity is not technical, it is political, emotional, and deeply human. And if that makes you uncomfortable, that's not a signal to retreat. It's a signal that you're finally getting close to leadership. Let me ground this in something concrete, not a hypothetical, not a textbook scenario, something I've seen more times than I would like to admit. This was a large organization, complex, regulated, politically dense. Multiple business units, overlapping mandates, competing priorities, and a leadership team that talked a lot about alignment while systematically avoiding decisions that would upset anyone important. At the center of it was a very capable enterprise architect, technically solid, well spoken, trusted, someone people liked having in the room. He knew the organization, understood the systems, and could articulate trade offs clearly. On paper, this was exactly the kind of person you would want shaping the architecture. And yet, over time, something became obvious. Nothing was changing. The architect could see the contradictions. He knew two transformation initiatives were pulling the enterprise in opposite directions. He knew the operating model being proposed didn't match the actual decision rights in the organization. He knew the roadmap timelines were politically motivated rather than operationally feasible. But every time those tensions surfaced, he softened them. He framed contradictions as future considerations. He turned the structural conflicts into areas for further analysis. He used careful language to avoid triggering discomfort. And every time someone pushed back, every time a senior leader deflected responsibility or reframed the issue, he adjusted his message to maintain harmony. The meetings were calm, productive even. Everyone left feeling heard. No one felt challenged, and that was the problem. What the architect was doing without realizing it was optimizing for comfort. He believed that maintaining trust meant avoiding confrontation, that leadership meant facilitating agreement, that being invited back into the room depended on not making things tense. But here's what happened next. Decisions were made anyway, not in the architecture forum, not with clarity and not with coherence. Business units pursued their own priorities, exceptions multiplied, governance was bypassed. The architecture artifacts were still referenced, but selectively when they supported someone's agenda. 6 months later, the same architect was asked why the architecture wasn't landing. From the organization's perspective, he had done everything right. He had been professional, diplomatic, methodical. From a leadership perspective, he had failed to do the one thing that mattered most: force the system to confront itself. No one ever accused him of being wrong, but no one followed him either. And that's the quiet tragedy of conflict avoidance. You don't get fired, you don't get openly criticized, you simply become optional. What struck me most in that situation wasn't the lack of competence, it was a misunderstanding of responsibility. The architect believed his job was to reflect the organization's consensus. In reality, his job was to reveal where consensus didn't and couldn't exist. Because real organizations are not coherent by default. They are negotiated into coherence, and negotiation requires friction. By avoiding conflict, the architect had unintentionally reinforced the organization's worst habits. He made it easier for leaders to postpone hard choices. He allowed ambiguity to masquerade as alignment. He enabled a system where everyone felt reasonable and nothing became real. This wasn't a moral failure, it was a leadership one. And I've seen this pattern repeat itself across industries and geographies. In aquaculture companies where operational industry silently overrides long term design, in agricultural organizations where tradition and seasonal shapes decisions more than a strategy ever does, and in professional service firms where consensus and client appeasement quietly replaced real leadership. Different contexts, same dynamic. Architects who equate leadership with harmony end up preserving dysfunction. Here's the lesson that matters: leadership is not about keeping people comfortable, it's about helping the organization face what it would rather avoid. And that means being willing to introduce tension deliberately, not recklessly, not emotionally, but intentionally. The architect who keeps everyone comfortable may be liked. The architect who generates constructive conflict may be resisted, but only one of them changes the trajectory of the enterprise. And if that feels risky, it should. Leadership is always is. To understand why so many architects struggle with leadership under pressure, it helps to step outside our usual reading list. Not toward another framework or method, but toward leadership literature that deals with something far less comfortable: emotional maturity. One of the most useful lenses I found comes from Harvard Business Review's 10 must reads on leadership, particularly the essays that focus on self regulation, responsibility, and the capacity to hold tension without collapsing into defensiveness or avoidance. These pieces don't romanticize leadership. They don't promise influence through charisma or authority. They describe leadership as the ability to stay grounded when the environment becomes difficult. And that distinction matters a lot. In architecture, we often assume that intelligence, experience, or technical mastery naturally translates into leadership, but emotional maturity is a separate competence altogether. It shows up not when things are working, but when they aren't, when priorities conflict, when stakeholders push back, when your recommendation threatens someone's turf, when the room becomes tense and everyone is waiting to see who blinks first. This is where many architects falter. Immaturity doesn't always look like emotional outbursts. In fact, it often looks professional, polished, calm, reasonable. It looks like retreating into abstractions when conversations get uncomfortable, like deferring decisions to process, like reframing conversation confrontation as analysis, like mistaking composure for courage. The HRB perspective is clear on this. Emotionally mature leaders don't eliminate anxiety, they contain it. They don't avoid discomfort, they metabolize it. They can sit with resistance without needing to win immediately, explain excessively, or withdraw. And most importantly, they don't confuse personal threat with professional disagreement. That last point is critical for architects. When an architectural position is challenged, many architects experience it as a challenge to their competence, or worse, to their identity. And once that happens, the goal subtly shifts. The conversation is no longer about what the enterprise needs, it becomes about preserving credibility, authority, or relevance. That's when defensiveness creeps in, or avoidance, or overstructuring. Emotional maturity is what allows you to notice that shift and interrupt it. A mature architect can say, "This resistance isn't about me." They can ask, "What is this conflict actually revealing about the system?" They can hold the position firmly without turning rigid. They can absorb pushback without personalizing it. And that capacity is not innate, it's developed, usually through experience, reflection, and failure, not certification. What the HRB essays repeatedly emphasize is that leadership maturity is less about asserting control and more about owning responsibility. Responsibility for naming what others want, for making trade offs explicit, for staying present when others disengage or posture. For architects, this means recognizing that leadership is not exercised when everyone agrees with you. It's exercised when agreement breaks down and you don't disappear. This is also why emotionally mature architects are often perceived as political, even when they are not playing games. They are simply willing to engage with reality as it is, not as the org charts suggests it should be. They understand that tension is not a sign of failure, but a sign that something important is at stake. And here's the uncomfortable implication. If you consistently avoid tension, it's not because the organization is healthy, it's because you are opting out of leadership. The architects who grow into real leaders are not the ones with the cleanest diagrams. They are the ones who can carry ambiguity without rushing to false certainty, who can withstand temporarily unpopularity without abandoning their judgment, who can hold the room steady when decisions get heavy. That's not a soft skill, it's a hard requirement. And without it, everything else, frameworks, methods, models, becomes cosmetic. At this point, it's worth reframing leadership entirely, especially for architects who've been taught implicitly or explicitly that leadership arrives later, after seniority, after authority, after someone else owns the strategy. That framing is wrong. Leadership for architects is not a downstream activity. It doesn't begin once decisions are made. It begins the moment you choose how to show up in moments of uncertainty. And it is expressed not through role, but through behavior. Let's be precise about what leadership actually looks like in architectural practice, because it rarely matches the popular image. Leadership is not being the smartest person in the room, it's being the clearest when everyone else is vague. Leadership is not facilitating endless alignment, it's knowing when alignment is a form of avoidance. Leadership is not having a neutral stance, it's taking a position and being willing to carry its consequences. For architects, this means developing a very specific set of leadership characteristics, ones that are rarely taught and often discouraged. First, the ability to take a clear stance. Architectural leadership requires judgment, and judgment requires commitment. You cannot lead if every recommendation is conditional, hedged, or endlessly qualified. Clarity is not rigidity, but without clarity, there is nothing to follow. Many architects believe they are being responsible by presenting options without preference. In reality, they are often outsourcing leadership to whoever has the loudest voice or the most authority in the room. Leadership begins when you say, given what we know, this is the direction I stand behind, and here's why. Second, the capacity to create constructive discomfort. Architects who lead understand that meaningful progress almost always feels uncomfortable at first. It challenges existing incentives. It threatens established power. It forces trade offs that someone would rather avoid. Leadership is not about manufacturing conflict, but it is about refusing to anesthetize it. If every architectural conversation feels smooth, something important is being suppressed. Leaders sense that and surface it deliberately, not emotionally, not aggressively, but clearly. Third, the ability to read the system beyond formal structure. Leadership in architecture requires situational awareness. Who actually decides? Who influences whom? Where are decisions delayed not because of complexity, but because of fear or politics? Architects who lead don't pretend these dynamics don't exist. They account for them. They design around them. They engage them. This doesn't mean manipulation, it means realism. Fourth, the willingness to absorb political cost. This is where leadership becomes real. Taking a stance costs something. Naming a conflict costs something. Challenging incoherence costs something. And many architects subconsciously avoid leadership because they are not willing to pay that price. They want influence without friction, authority without exposure, respect without risk. Leadership doesn't work that way. Architects who lead accept that they may be misunderstood, that they may be resisted, that they may not be immediately rewarded, but they also understand something else. Relevance is built through impact, not comfort. Fifth, the discipline to separate ego from responsibility. Leadership is not about winning arguments, it's about stewarding outcomes. Mature architects know when to push and when to pause, when to insist and when to adapt, and they don't confuse disagreement with disrespect. They are able to say, this isn't about me, but I'm still accountable for what happens next. This is where leadership transcends competence. You can be technically exceptional and still fail here because leadership is not an extension of intelligence, it is an extension of character. And this is the reframe that matters most. Architectural leadership is not about being right, it's about being responsible. Responsible for surfacing reality, responsible for forcing clarity, responsible for shaping decisions, not just documenting them. If that feels heavier than what you sign up for, that's because it is. But it's also the difference between being an architect who executes and one who leads. I want to pause here and speak directly to two groups of people. First, to those who are not enterprise architects yet but feel drawn to the role. You may be analysts, engineers, consultants, product managers, or managers who sense that your work is no longer just about execution. You see patterns, you notice contradictions, you feel the pull toward systems thinking and long term impact, but you don't yet have the title, the authority, or the seat at the table. And second, to those of you who already carry the architect title, but sometimes feel that your influence doesn't match your responsibility. This applies to both of you. Leadership in architecture does not begin with the role. It begins with how you handle tension before anyone asks you to. Here's the test. Look at your current environment, your team, your project, your organization. There is at least one situation where something feels off, a decision that doesn't quite make sense, a priority that contradicts another, a rule that exists in theory but not in practice, a direction that everyone follows without ever really questioning. If you're early in your career, you probably notice these things but tell yourself, it's not my place. If you're already an architect, you might tell yourself, I've raised it before, or that's a leadership issue. Both responses are understandable, and both are ways of stepping back from leadership. So here's the exercise, simple, but not easy. Identify one tension you can see clearly, not a massive organizational problem, something local, something real. Then ask yourself one question: what will it look like to name this tension responsibly without authority? That might mean asking a clarifying question in a meeting instead of staying silent. It might mean pointing out an inconsistency in a plan, not as criticism, but as curiosity. It might mean connecting two dots that others haven't connected yet and letting the discomfort sit in the room. This is leadership before the title. For those already in architectural roles, the challenge is slightly different but equally demanding. Ask yourself, where have I normalized ambiguity instead of challenging it? Where have I accepted misalignment because pushing further would have been politically uncomfortable? Where have I hidden behind my role instead of exercising it? Leadership shows up when you decide that clarity is more important than comfort, when you choose to surface reality rather than smooth it over, when you act as if the future of the system matters, even if no one explicitly asks you to. And here's the critical insight. Organizations start treating you like a leader long before they formally recognize you as one. They watch how you behave under uncertainty, how you speak when things are unclear, whether you default to safety or to responsibility. If you want to become an architect, start here. If you already are one, recalibrate here. Because leadership is not something you are promoted into, it's something you practice, often quietly, often early, and always before it's comfortable. Let me say this plainly, because someone has to. Politeness is not leadership. Professionalism is not leadership. And being easy to work with is not leadership. Too many architects confuse good manners with impact. They believe that if conversations remain calm, if no one feels challenged, if meetings end on time and everyone nods politely, then something productive must have happened. Most of the time, nothing did. What actually happened is that discomfort was avoided, trade offs were postponed, responsibility was diluted, and ambiguity was allowed to harden into reality. We've created a culture where architects are rewarded for being agreeable, not for being effective, where speaking clearly is seen as abrasive, where challenging assumptions is labeled as political, and where silence is mistaken for maturity. That culture doesn't produce leaders, it produces caretakers of this dysfunction. Here's the uncomfortable truth: if everyone leaves the room comfortable, nothing important happened. Leadership requires friction, not chaos, not aggression, friction. The kind that forces choices into the open, the kind that makes priorities visible, the kind that exposes what the organization is actually willing to commit to. And yes, that means some people won't like you in the moment. That's not a flaw, it's a signal. It means you touched something real. Architects who avoid that moment often tell themselves they are playing the long game. In reality, they are eroding their relevance because organizations don't listen to those who never make things uncomfortable. They listen to those who help them see clearly, even when they don't enjoy what they see. So, if your version of leadership depends on being liked, approved of, or perpetually invited back, you're not leading. You're managing your image. Leadership is not about keeping the temperature low. It's about knowing when to let the heat rise and staying steady when it does. And if that makes you uneasy, good. That uneasiness is the cost of leadership. Let's bring this together. Leadership for architects is not about frameworks, titles, or seniority. It's about competence under pressure, about how you behave when clarity is missing, when interests collide, and when decisions carry real consequences. Today, we establish a few hard truths. Avoiding conflict is not maturity, it's abdication. Politeness is not leadership, it's often a mask for fear. And neutrality in complex organizations is not a virtue, it's a decision to let others lead. Architectural leadership shows up when you are willing to generate constructive tension, when you can take a clear stance without becoming rigid, when you can hold discomfort without retreating into process or abstraction, and when you accept that influence always carries a political cost. That doesn't mean manipulation, it means realism. Organizations are political systems whether we acknowledge it or not. Power exists, incentives exist, informal hierarchies exist, and the architect who refuses to engage with those dynamics doesn't rise above them. He or she is sidelined by them. The leaders who matter are not the ones who wait for permission. They are the ones who step into ambiguity and help the organization confront itself calmly, clearly, responsively. If you're aspiring to become an architect, this is where your journey actually begins, not with tools, but with how you handle tension. If you already are one, this is your recalibration point, not toward more structure, but toward more courage. And this brings us to what comes next. In the next episode, we'll stop dancing around the word that makes so many architects uncomfortable politics. Not as a gossip, not as games, but as the real operating system of organizations. We'll talk about office politics the way adults should, without apology, without naivety, and without pretending it doesn't matter. Because leadership without political competence is fragile, and architecture without leadership is decoration. Until then, pay attention to where you avoid friction. Notice where you choose comfort over clarity. And remember, leadership doesn't start when someone gives you authority, it starts when you decide to carry responsibility. That's it for today, but as always, this conversation is just the beginning. Enterprise architecture, done seriously, is not just about systems or structure. It's about power, judgment, leadership, and the willingness to operate in reality as it actually is, not as we wish it were. If this episode challenged you, sit with that discomfort. If it unsettled you, don't rush to resolve it. That tension is often where growth begins. Until then, reflect deeply, lead intentionally, and remember every diagram you create carries your bias, even when you call it the standard. Thank you.